Welcome to Dwell on These Things, a podcast by Dwell Community Church in Columbus, Ohio, where we hear stories and examples of how God is moving in the church at Dwell and around the world.
All right, to start us off, just introduce myself. I'm Pat Reeder. I'm the director here of equipping at Dwell Community Church. Got a few guests with me here, and so each of you has done some study and had some experience with what we might call like a movement away from mainstream Christianity. That could be deconversion, that could be deconstruction, or that could be dechurching. So why don't we just go down the line? Tell us a little bit about yourself, introduce yourself, your area of research, and to some extent, you know, there might have to be some discussion about how each of these domains is different and but also how they overlap. So start with Ian.
Yeah, my name is Ian Harber. I am the Director of Communications and Marketing for a Christian publication called Mere Orthodoxy, and I wrote a book called Walking Through Deconstruction: How to Be a Companion in a Crisis of Faith. And so, yeah, my book comes a lot from personal experience. Deconstruction is a part of my story. Good 10 plus years was sort of that journey, kind of going through it. Deconstructing and reconstructing. And so a lot of it comes from me. It's wanting to kind of dive into the personal stories of people, of my own story, of getting to the personal existential aspect of it. I'm sure we'll talk about this. I think it's really easy to look at people who are deconstructing just sort of either as a large group of people and ignore the stories, or to think about it in very intellectual registers, when I think that's part of it, but it's more than that as well. And so what I really wanted to do was, honestly, in a lot of ways, write the book I wish everyone around me had when I was going through it, of just, because I wasn't able to process what was happening to me in real time. It was just what was happening. And so kind of being on this side of things now, being able to step back and say, okay, I see this pattern in my life and other people's stories that I'm seeing and reading and know, and kind of trace those patterns of what deconstruction is versus what it isn't also. And then the back half of my book is really, here's some helpful paradigm shifts, really, when you are walking with someone through deconstruction and you're having those conversations and you feel anxious and you feel like you don't know how to handle this. So like, how can we approach the people? How can we approach those conversations in ways that might be helpful? And frankly, in ways that the conversations with me weren't being had, and that I kind of wish that they were. But it's so interesting. Like just last week, I was having a conversation with a friend who's been deconstructed the past few years. And I found myself having conversations from my own book with him. And I was like, this is very meta, but I guess I'm using my own book with my friend now. So this is great, So yeah.
That's great. Thanks. Michael?
Yeah. Hi, I'm Michael Graham, the program director for the Keller Center for Cultural Apologetics, which is a division of the Gospel Coalition. That's just a fancy way to say we're kind of like the research and development wing of TGC.
Great.
And so we try to make resources that help people communicate the gospel more effectively to the people who in their lives. I wrote a book entitled The Great Dechurching. Dechurching is a phenomenon that's defined as somebody who used to have a long-term habit of going to church on a monthly or greater basis, and now they don't go at all each year. And so that's 40 million of adult Americans, so about 1 in 6 U.S. adults fits that category. Now, as it pertains to the 3 Ds of this conversation of deconversion, deconstruction, and dechurching, there's kind of like a Venn diagram here of where you can be dechurched and deconverted, or you can be dechurched and going through deconstruction. You could be all 3 of those things at the same time, or you might only be one of those 3 things.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
So if you ever seen like some of the like the Trinity kind of Venn diagram or whatever. It's kind of like that, and so it's hard to say exactly what percentage of people who have dechurched have deconstructed versus deconverted. Of the 40 million people who stopped going to church, 15 million of those people left evangelical churches. Of the 15 million people who left evangelical churches, it looks about 10 million of them are not Christians, and about 5 million of them looks like they have like a kind of a Nicene Creed basic understanding of the gospel.
Got it.
But how many of those, 10 million who aren't Christians today would have said that they had a conversion experience? We don't know.
Sure.
And so just as it pertains to those 3Ds, they might all sound like the same thing, at face value, but in social science and sociology of religion, you have belief, behavior, and belonging.
Yeah.
And it can be confusing when, someone might have one or two of those three things intact, but maybe not, some of the others. So that's why we have some different terms for some of those different things.
No, that's very helpful, and that's part of why I wanted to get you guys all in the same room. Is that it's like I think some people hear one of these expressions, and then that just loads up all the other ones, and so it's like no, these all kind of they are interacting. There is overlap, but they're not identical, and you might encounter somebody still in some kind of Christian fellowship who considers themselves to be deconstructing, or you might again these can come apart. So absolutely.
And you really do need to know something about all three.
Yeah.
So that you can discern, what am I looking at here? And, which of these three things are at play in this particular person's story.
Right. And John's discussion this morning, like that's so essential about listening. Like where, if I hear one of these things and I might just load up this whole package of ideas, and it's like, no, I need to listen long enough to figure out what's actually happening here. Yeah, John, what about you?
Yeah, my name is John Marriott, and I teach in Talbot School of Theology at Biola University in Los Angeles, California. And I work with the Harvard Human Flourishing Program, specifically on flourishing in the church. What does that look like, and how does the church contribute to flourishing communities and well-being? And I also teach one course for a Christian high school. I teach the seniors their worldview course. And out of all the three things that I do, that might be my favorite.
That's awesome. That's great.
Oh, and so my area of interest is the third D, which is deconversion. And when I think about deconversion, what I'm thinking about is that there's people who once identified as a Christian, they once belonged to a fellowship, and they once said, I really believe these claims about Jesus and about his death and his resurrection, but I don't anymore. I've come to the place now where I don't think that any of that is true. And so I have renounced my faith. I'm not part of a church. I don't associate with Christians anymore. And I interview folks and try and figure out why did that happen? And what are some of the factors that bring people to the beginning of that process? What does the process itself look like? Because, is there a point of no return in the process for many people?
Yeah.
And what's the impact in the lives of people who have left the faith? And then and now branching out into, and when some people return, why are they returning and what are they returning to?
That's great. Yeah, actually, I thought it was very interesting when you mentioned this morning that like 3 years is a pretty good like benchmark for, if someone's going through a full-on deconversion process. That takes time. It's like very, very interesting. Good to have this kind of research out there to understand what's going on. I appreciate having all three of you here for that reason. I think a natural thought for pastors or churchgoers, or just anyone who's working, trying to follow Jesus, they're wondering like, how can I prevent somebody from going down this path, or should I prevent them? Like, I think just a lot of times people are scared. They interact with these issues. They're just, they become really nervous. That person's crisis becomes your crisis, and so I guess I wanted you guys, if you could comment a little bit about what do you say to somebody who's like, what would I do now? Do I want to prevent them? Should I prevent them? Just any thoughts on like, if they're kind of moving away from, if they're having a crisis of faith and, they might be moving along a certain process, or they're like, I'm thinking about taking off from my church. Like, how do we help that person? Should we even prevent them? And frankly, we've talked some about like toxic churches. Like maybe maybe they should leave that church and go, anyway. So I wonder if you guys could talk some about prevention or prophylaxis on this when it comes to these issues.
Okay, I'll jump in.
Take a swing.
All right. I sometimes joke that kids raised in Christian homes need to get saved 3 times before it actually sticks. And what I mean by that is they grow up in a Christian home and they make a profession at a young age. And then at 14, they go to a Bible camp, and the preacher at the Bible camp says, God has no grandchildren, that it can't be your parents' faith. It's got to be your own faith. You need to own your faith. And then in the 1980s, everyone was rededicating, right? Everyone rededicated their life because they said, I really want to make it mine. It's really got to be me.
Yeah.
And then they got into their 20s, and then they said, is this even true? I accepted it because my parents told me. I owned it because I came to the place where I realized that I needed to make that decision. But now I'm starting to ask the question because maybe I've gotten to the place where I'm intellectually mature enough that I can step outside of my worldview, look back on it with a critical eye, and I realize I've never asked the question before, is what I actually believe true?
Yeah.
So I do think that there is, when you ask, is it something we can prevent? I'm not sure that it's something that we can prevent. I think it's just a natural process of maturing as a person. If a person takes their faith seriously, they will kind of go through this process where they ask themselves critical questions. I think we need to be there with helpful answers and resources. But I'm not sure that it's something, especially since now we live in the age where I'm finding objections from people that I'm talking with are objections that nobody knew 20 years ago unless you were in a seminary.
Sure.
But the internet has allowed 1,000 atheist apologists to bloom. And there are challenges out there online that people are coming across in junior high, and they have no idea how to handle them.
Right.
And there are very few people in their Christian circles who know how to answer those questions.
Right.
I think that the best that we can do is to be there, to be present, to listen, and to try and help as much as we can. But I don't think that we can ever prevent them from asking these questions.
Right. There's like a shepherding involved, but you're not trying to just like put the shepherd's crook in the way.
Right.
You're sort of like, okay, maybe not that direction, but more this way.
Yes, that's right.
You look, you had something, Ian.
Well, yeah. First of all, it's so interesting you say 3 times. I feel like there are actually 3 experiences I can point to that are kind of milestones. That's so fascinating. But
for you?
Yeah, for me. Yeah. I don't know if I don't like using the word prevent because I think one of the contentions that I'm trying to make is that there's an aspect of deconstruction, whether you use that word or not, that is a normal spiritual process that people go through. Lewis in the Screwtape Letters has this bit, of course it's from the demon's perspective, but he's talking about how what we want to do is keep out of people's minds that this law of undulation, that there are peaks and valleys in our life, in our faith, and keep that out of your patient's mind, Wormwood, because anytime they're at the peak, they're going to think that lasts forever. And then they're going to find out it doesn't. And they're going to fall down into the trough. And they're going to think that lasts forever. And there's a way of talking about deconstruction that I think is really helpful. Where basically in one of those troughs, it doesn't matter if it's early or late in someone's faith, in one of those troughs, someone just hits a wall. And that wall is the dark night of the soul or, something like that, where everything about your faith just stops working. The presence of God becomes the absence of God. And that doesn't mean God has actually left you, but your felt experience of God has left you.
Yeah.
And that is normal, but it freaks people out because nobody tells you that that's a thing. Our churches are set up to basically help people get saved, help people get in community, and help people get into some sort of leadership position, like a home group leader or something like that. That's great. There's nothing wrong with that. That's not where your faith ends. You have a long life ahead of you to walk with God through with all that. And a lot of that looks very boring, mundane, or maybe sometimes you just go through a decade of, God, where are you? And nobody tells you that. And so some of this has to do with expectations, right? Of helping people understand what the Christian life actually is. And it's not this up and to the right, I'm always on fire, I'm always experiencing more and more of the presence of God. It's not that. It's just simply not that. And so, I don't like thinking in terms of prevent. What I like to think in terms of is intensity. I think there are people, we were talking about this right before we came out here, there are people, and I think I was one of them, who were handed Sunday school answers for academic questions, and there has to become a point where your faith does grow up. And it's not that all of those answers are wrong. It's that they're deeper than you were ever told that they were. But nobody ever told you why they were those things. And so the moment they're met with any sort of criticism, you were only given the statement, the axiom, the whatever. You were never given the things that actually support that. And so it all falls apart because you just have the tagline. You don't have everything else. You don't have the book, right? And so being able to, I do think you can lessen people's intensity by a few things. One, actually handing people a robust faith. Paul says in Colossians that in Christ are hidden all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. So if you can open up Christ and dig down forever and never touch the bottom, that's the kind of faith we need to be giving people, right? And then there's also the relational bonds of being thick communities that actually care about each other, don't judge people for having questions or going through these things or going through an extended period of time, not feeling God's presence or going through suffering and treating that person like an anathema, like maybe something happened to them, like they did something to bring this on their life. But to actually create those strong, thick social bonds that we are supposed to be as a church anyways. So those are a couple things that it's not preventing, but it's we understand what you're going through, and that is welcome here, and we're going to walk with you through it and understand and help you.
Yeah, I mean, I'll admit I definitely threw out the word prevent as a kind of a piece of bait. You know what I mean?
I took it.
Yeah, it's good. It's good. And one, I like your point about also just the lived Christian experience. I mean, Jesus says, "Pick up your cross daily and follow me." And I think if our portrait of Christianity is, as in your language, up and to the right, it's like that doesn't have a really that has a very S&P 500 feel to it. It's like we're just. Really, it's just growing and growing, and that's just like Jesus's way is like this. Is we're looking at a bull market over and over. And it's like no, like actually, like you need to pick up your cross. Like there's going to be serious and hard decisions when it comes to like following Jesus, and you may come under persecution. You may experience deep, dark suffering. I think you mentioned grief observed, and I mean everyone's talking about Lewis these days, but you have this idea that that's a pretty frightening portrait. Like the first will be last will be first. The one who tries to save the one who tries to save his life will lose it. The one who loses his life for my sake will gain it. I mean, this is very what's counterintuitive, I think, frankly, to the human experience at large. But I think especially sort of American Christianity has a very, as you say, up and to the right sort of. Let's go get them, rah feel. So, yeah. Michael, did you want to throw anything on in this discussion?
Yeah. So two things. There's two main types of de-churching.
Yeah.
People who do so very casually and unintentionally, and then people who are de-churched casualties. Those are people who are more going through a crisis of faith. Yeah. So how you treat either of them looks very different. Mm-hmm. But in terms of, I'll bite on the preventable word. I would say for the casually de-churched, there is a level of preventability that's there.
Yeah.
The number one area of preventability on de-churching surrounds when people move. So 1 in 5 people who de-church will de-church primarily because they moved. And so that's something that, if you're here in this room or you're here and you're listening to this, everybody can play a role in that. Move is a 4-letter word. And even if you love Jesus deeply and you love his church deeply, you still have to pack all the boxes. Right. You still have to find all the new medical providers. You still have to maybe even buy and sell, and go through all of those processes. So if you love somebody who's in your life who's going through the 4-letter word move, you can do something to help them. And the thing that you can do to help them is begin to do due diligence and research for them on healthy local churches in the new community where it is that they're moving. And if you're listening to this and you're a pastor or you're a church leader, the moment that somebody is going down that process, that's absolutely not the time to end the shepherding relationship. It's actually a time to increase the shepherding relationship so that you have a good, clean handoff from one shepherd, into another healthy local church in that new community. So I would say that's probably the number one area where not, every single person has a role to play on, from a prevention standpoint with just simple, just being a good friend.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh, I can go and listen to, 3 sermons from 6 different churches, and I can type up a summary, for a friend. And hey, I looked at these 6. I think these 3 are the most promising. If I were in your shoes, I would check it, spend 5 weeks at each of these 3. And, and is it okay if I, follow up with you, every 2 to 3 months and just see kind of how that process is going?
Yeah, that's an interesting point you mentioned about moving. I mean, I would imagine also just life transitions in general, becoming a parent, getting married, starting work, seeing family members die, just any, what does your research say on that? And actually, I'm curious about you guys as well. Like, what is the role that life transitions play? You mentioned narrative injury this morning, but, have you guys observed anything with that broadly, just life transitions and impacting people?
That's the number 3 thing for de-churching.
Got it. Yeah. Well, very succinct. Thank you.
So I think that, just as the age range when people leave their faith typically is somewhere between, it's getting earlier and earlier, but generally it's between 18 and 29. I think the Pew Research Center had stats that came out earlier this year or last year, and they said that about 30% of Christians leave their faith before they're 30 years old. And it's a significant number. And I think part of the reason why that is just because that's a significant life change, right? So you really do move away from home, and you're outside of a community, you're outside of a fellowship. You may go off to university, and it's not just being at university and getting exposed to new ideas, although that's part of it sometimes, but it's being away and being free to think for yourself. It's the prodigal son didn't commit his sin in his hometown. He went far away from home, and when he was there, he had no restraints. And I think that that's part of it as well. And that period of life is also the period where you become intellectually and mentally mature enough to be able to look back critically on your faith. And that's why I think it happens, deconversion anyway, typically happens at that point in life, because you've been handed a faith, you've lived the faith, and then now you're saying, I'm not sure that this is true. Couldn't have done it any earlier. For some people, it does happen later. And usually when that happens, because it's later, it's because something tragic or traumatic has happened. Mm-hmm. And they have had this narrative injury where the life that they've been living can't be seen through the same lenses anymore, because something so difficult and so hard has happened. They can't reconcile that with their former Christian worldview. Because if God is good and God is loving, then why would he have allowed X to happen?
Right.
But that would be probably the smaller percentage of people who leave the faith. It would be for those reasons, as opposed to just the natural progression that we go through as we mature through the late adolescence, early young adulthood.
Got it. So what I'm taking from this is that Michael's saying that the de-churching process occurs more at these joints. That's the number 3 reason. But yeah, these transitions, you're saying, well, it can happen in these life transitions, but it's more often to happen within the certain age range of growing up, and a specific trend goes along with that. You're saying like that it's like you hit a certain life stage, you're kind of reach a certain sort of intellectual maturity that you look back, and that's sort of a particular thing that impacts deconversion in particular, right?
Yes, and there might be one, maybe part of the difference between deconversion and de-churching at this point would be that the de-churching I would assume would be significantly social. Right. And the deconversion would be a little bit more cognitive and intellectual, where they say, hey, I don't believe this anymore. It's a clean break. It's a severing of identity, where the de-churching would be, this community I'm not part of this community anymore.
Right. That's helpful. Ian, do you want to throw anything on this?
Yeah. John, what you were just saying about it, I think that's a good distinction. I think the thing I would add to that is that even the intellectual process is probably in a lot of ways downstream from a more existential experience, right? This is, we're not brains on a stick. Like we move with our loves, And so when suffering is certainly part of my story, and it is part of lots of people's stories. I mean, I think of 2 people on my mind right now. Both of them deconstructed and left their faith after their parents got a divorce. And both of their sets of parents, in one case, the person's mom, in the other case, both their parents were very involved in like leadership positions in the church or just in the community in general. And so there was sort of this projection of we are a serious Christian family. And then both of their marriages fell apart, and so did both of my friends' faiths. And so that's an aspect of it. And so I do think thinking in terms of suffering, both in terms of suffering that causes deconstruction or deconversion, and then that process itself as suffering is really important, because suffering is loss. We suffer because we lose something. And so going through that process of deconstruction and deconversion is an intellectual process, but it is also loss. If you think about, just at a basic level, maybe the most fundamental level, but also the most basic level, you're losing God in that process. And if you primarily see, you've been told, and this is true, that God is your father, then you're losing what you have been told is the best version of a parent that you could possibly have, someone who is supposed to have ultimate care for you. You no longer believe has that ultimate care for you. But it's not just your belief in God, you're part of God's community, God's family, the church. And so if you lose God, you lose your community. So not only are you ostracized, separated from God, you're separated from your community. And if you're not, a child of God, you're not finding your identity in Christ, then who are you? Who am I? Who even am I apart from this world that I was raised in or have become a part of? And if you lose that, then you start losing your moral sense of right and wrong. And so there's a series of losses that happen that are more fundamental than just like an identification. That's part of it. But that identification brings with it this whole other series of losses that are intellectual for sure. But that intellectual has existential consequences that are terrifying when you're going through them.
Very, very much so. Because if you convert to Christianity or Buddhism or Hinduism, you convert to a community, you convert to a system of thought, you convert to a way of life, a bunch of rituals. When you lose your Christian faith, you don't gain anything. Right? You lose your identity, you lose the purpose and meaning of life. Now, you might find that somewhere else, but for the most part, people who deconvert or leave their Christian faith aren't looking for faith somewhere else because they already think that there really is nothing else out there. And so I think that's a really important point, that when people leave, they leave really to a vacuum or to a void in their life. And then they have to try and fill it with something else.
Well, and that's what's interesting. So they don't find anything except for maybe a perceived sense of freedom, right? And that's why there's such a paradox with these conversations, is you talk to the person and they feel both fear and freedom at the same time. It's like, how do you navigate that? Because there is fear from all of the loss that you've experienced, but there is sort of this feeling of freedom that comes from, these chains that have been put on me for my whole life are all of a sudden thrown off, and it's really scary in some regards, but there's a kind of a wide open blue ocean in front of you at the same time, which for a lot of people is very freeing and very thrilling. But I think that's the whole bunch of different conversations around there. Freedom, what kind of freedom? Freedom from something or freedom for something? These are, what are you free to do? Anything you want, so you're just a slave to yourself now? That's great. But I think that's definitely part of it. But so it's this, I kind of lost the trail I was going down, but that perceived sense of freedom. For sure.
The title of my dissertation was The Cost of Freedom. And that's because of all the people who I interviewed who once identified as Christians and then left the faith. Almost every single one of them said, it's been hard. I've lost meaning in life. I've lost purpose in life. My relationships with my family have been severed. A couple of them said that they've lost jobs, but then they would always add, but it's worth it. For the freedom that they felt, the liberation that they felt. And that says something about the kind of Christianity, in a way, that they were also raised in. Because although Jesus is counterintuitive and Jesus is countercultural and he calls us to a lot of hard things, he also says that his burden is light and his yoke is easy. And so it makes me wonder when I hear people who have left their faith talk about how much freedom that they have now, it makes me wonder the kind of Christianity that they came out of. Because there should certainly be some kind of a balance of, yes, Jesus calls you to deny yourself, but in denying yourself is where you actually find joy and happiness and true freedom. And so many people who leave their faith find exactly the opposite in their Christian experience.
Yeah, that really matches what you said last night too about the age of authenticity. It's like, what are people grasping for is where I essentially become at the center of this whole thing. I'm authentic to me. I'm now the determiner of my identity, the sole determiner of my identity, which of course, as you mentioned, brings with it all manner of fears and anxieties, but it's a sort of, at least that's the story that frequently that's the story that fills the void. Mm-hmm. There's kind of this, well, as you put it, social imaginary, there's a kind of worldview in there, but it's like it also fits in with all these technologies and stories and other things that buttress this. Ian, did you have something you wanted to throw in?
Well, I was going to say you picked up the trail where I lost it. Thank you. But, basically, I think that perceived sense of freedom comes from the perceived sense of slavery that they felt growing up, right? And so I think this has a lot to do with how we both the kinds of churches that we create and the kinds of parents that we are, of what are we handing down to these people in our churches, And so there's this quote from Taylor Swift at like a NYU commencement address.
That great American philosopher.
That's right. She's speaking at the NYU commencement address a few years ago, and I'm summarizing, but she basically says, I have some good news for you. Your future and who you are is entirely up to you. And I know it can be overwhelming, and I know it can be terrifying, but it's completely up to you. And I wanted to say, did you hear yourself? This is good news. It's so overwhelming, and it's so terrifying that who you are is completely up to you. And I just wanted to say, we want to talk about anxiety. That sounds overwhelming and terrifying. Maybe it's not completely up to me. And so we can't just send people from one form of slavery to another. Let's talk about, yes, we're slaves to Christ, but what does that do for it? It actually frees us up. And so, yeah.
I actually want to ask, and of course, you guys have written entire books on this stuff, but okay, there's the preventive thing, caught you on some of those. But then there's also okay, once they're going through it or they're on their way through, they're maybe on the other side, they've de-churched, they've deconverted, do you have a couple of ideas or advice for, Christian believers, followers whose family members, whose loved ones really want to love and to minister to someone that's entered this space? Again, you've written books. I know. I'm not like, hey, summarize your whole book in maybe 30 seconds. But brief thoughts. I'm going to throw it to Michael real quick on this. Do you have brief thoughts on how can we love? What are some just key basic thoughts, just checkpoints to work with?
The first thing I want to say is it's important that we do take some relational risk. The second thing I want to say is become collectors of good questions.
Great.
So for me, every question that I ask, whether it's evangelism or discipleship, really boils down at its essence to these two questions. What do you want, and what are you afraid of? Wants and fears are what drive, from my vantage point, most human behaviors. And so you can't just ask the question, though, what do you want, and what are you afraid of? You have to be in very deep relationship with somebody to ask those things that bluntly. But, and I mentioned this in my talk, if you grab lunch with me, one of the things, or if you talk, if we talk on the phone, every conversation I ever have, I'll ask this question in that conversation. What are you looking forward to? And that's just a way to repackage the, what do you want question.
Sure.
And so for me, I think the first thing is getting over our fear of man, and by moving towards somebody and taking a relational risk and having some spiritual conversation. And then the second thing is asking good questions. And if you need to have some basic categories of what kinds of questions to ask about people's wants and ask about people's fears, and they'll begin to tell you some of the things that are on their mind and on their heart. And just sit and listen. They'll tell you which facets of the gospel will speak most powerfully to them.
Yeah. Randy Newman, RIP, when he actually visited here and spoke on his idea about questioning, and part of his ideas were, I think very challenging and thoughtful, but it was also, he pointed out, like, this is what Jesus did. He's always asking questions, and sometimes instead of answering a question, he asks another question. It's like someone asks him a question, he like flips around and asks another one. I'm like, there is some exceptional, and now on some level, I think that's a, Hebraism or whatever, like that's kind of a verbal style. But I also think it's like some brilliant relational ability. It's just knowing how to have good questions and get people talking.
Pat, can I tell you a secret?
Yes.
Okay. If you run into a conversation where you hit a relational stop sign, or you run into, basically the you ask a question and they say, I don't know. Here's what you do in response. You say, if you did know, what would you say? If you did know, what would you say? Because here's what happens.
Zen master.
When you ask somebody a question, it will access a certain part of their brain. Okay? But if they tell you, if that part of that brain, when it's queried, comes back with, I don't know, when you come back with, if you did know, what would you say? You end up accessing a different part of their brain, the part of the brain that deals with problem solving.
Creativity.
Yes. And so that little follow-up there of, if you did know, what would you say, will help extend spiritual conversations a lot longer, and it will force them to go from one plane of thinking to a different plane of thinking.
That's cool. Yeah,
So that's my secret.
Oh, that's good. And I think, were you mentioning Daniel Kahneman?
I
feel like I've been, bumping into him over and over again. But yeah, just this, kind of getting people to shift out of these different, cognitive zones or whatever,
But I have to say, I have asked my high school students, what do you think about that? And they say, I don't know. I follow up with the question, if you did know, what would you say? And that's the response I get. So you may need to do it with somebody who's older than high school.
I was just going to say that might just be
a brilliant question to ask. It is a brilliant question to ask.
That's good. That's good. Yeah, unfortunately, some people are just ignorant. So they might, the I don't know lands also on another I don't know. I'm just kidding. No, that's great. Any thoughts, Ian?
This is going to sound like the opposite of Mike for a second, but it's not. It's related. One of my favorite stories is from, in my mind, the patron saint of deconstructors, Augustine. And there's a story that he writes in Confessions where basically he leaves the faith and he goes to the Manichees, and his mom, Monica, is like freaking out about it. And so she goes to her priest and basically is like, hey, you need to go talk to Augustine and set him right. And he says, no, I'm not going to go talk to him. And she says, why not? And he goes, he has to go through what some doctors call the crisis, which is just incredible that he actually used that. That priest knew what was going on. And that's not to say we shouldn't sit down and have conversations and ask those questions. I think we should be doing that. I think the lesson to learn from that is patience and being able to, Monica approached initially the crisis her son was going through with anxiety. And when she went to the priest with her anxiety, he met her with calm and said, I'm not going to try to control this situation. I'm not going to try to control what Augustine does or doesn't do. I'm not going to try to, go convert him or whatever, get him to stop, prevent him, He was able to be patient with him. In fact, I think he even said, he's like, Augustine's a smart dude, obviously. Like, he's going to read his way out of this eventually. And so I don't think that means we separate and don't intervene at all. But I do think that those lessons of being patient and taking the long-term view, it took Augustine 10, 12 years before he came out of it. And just being able to say, whatever the response to this situation needs to be, I need to be calm about it. Yeah. And maybe we do harbor some fears and some anxieties about it, but expressing those to that person and trying to control them, that's what go back to the perceived sense of freedom. That's what they're trying to get away from, is that control. And so being able to just be patient with them, not cast all of our anxieties on them and their situation, but actually just continue to love them and just be there for them. What Augustine needed from Monica in that moment was just for Monica to be his mom, you know? And sure enough, that's what, I mean, you go read chapters later, books later in Confessions, and it's like, I cried for you every night. And he said, he comes back to her and he, you know, tells her, hey, I think I'm a Christian again. And she like doesn't react at all. Like she's already spent 10 years processing this with God. And she's just like, great, you know? And so there's something about that patient, non-anxious presence in somebody's life that I think is really, really important.
And in fact, if you don't have that patience, then you can push people further and further away.
Yeah.
If you read deconversion narratives online or talk to anybody, the biggest strain in the relationship that they have with their parents is that their parents are continually trying to reconvert them. They invite them to conferences like this one, and they say, have you watched this YouTube video? And they leave Bible tracts around the house when they come over for dinner, to the point where people say, I have to cut ties, or I can't be around you. We can't have these conversations. I think one thing that might be helpful, though, is when you do have the conversation and someone says, this is where I'm at, this is what I'm struggling with, is maybe to be able to say, hey, this is not about me. It for sure is about you. But you know, this does affect your mother and I, or it affects me as your spouse. Can you give me some time to process this? And would you be willing to meet me again in a month and for me to ask you important questions that I need some answers for, not to attack you, not to try and persuade you, but so that I can have some sense of peace in my mind that, was it something that I did? Was, you know, is there some catalyst that I missed? And would you be willing to meet me, because I have some issues that I would like to have some resolution for? And then number two, what are the ground rules that you would be willing to abide by? I'll let you set them for our relationship. Can I ask you every 6 months, hey, where are you on this issue? Or is that too often? Can we get together for coffee once a year and have a State of the Union address? And you can tell me, no, I'm still not a Christian anymore. But what would be the ground rules that you would be willing to set, that I would be willing to abide by for the sake of maintaining and continuing on a relationship with you?
Yeah, that fits what you were saying. Well, I can't remember this morning or maybe last night about keeping. Yeah. I know. What time is it? What day is it? You were talking just about like keeping the relationship going, keeping communication lines open. So Ross Douthat, commentator or, you know, op-ed writer for the New York Times, has like talked recently about there being kind of a vibe shift in the culture. And Americans seem more open to old ideas. And actually, I think, John, you got a question about this last night, but I'm going to ask it again. But that people are open to Christianity, it seems, in ways that they haven't in a while. And some headlines from the last several months in the New York Times, it says, Christianity's decline in the U.S. appears to have halted. In Vanity Fair in March, it says, Christianity was borderline illegal in Silicon Valley. Now it's the new religion. That's a little sensationalist, I'll admit. But the point is, we have secular sources publishing these things. This isn't Christianity Today, like, you know, spinning noisemakers and, you know. And in The Economist, just last month, it says, God is back in the West. Or one of the other forms was, the West has stopped losing its religion. That one's a little bit more muted. But these articles keep coming out. And again, these are coming from secular sources, not from Christians just trying to like get the pep rally started up again. What are your thoughts on this movement, especially in the Economist article? It's very explicit that these are Gen Z adult conversions, people that were not in Christian homes. So I'm wondering if you could comment on this movement towards Christianity and its relationship to what you've studied, and if you have any thoughts on that.
I think late modernity, this period of time in the West that we're living in, is very unlivable. So when I think about if you're over 40, you know, the big idols, you know, if you're millennial, Gen X, or boomer, our greatest generation, sex, money, power, and then more recently technology. But if you're in Gen Z, let's look at how each of those different idols is working. Sex is a mess. The sexual marketplace is a mess. Most people find relationships through apps, but those apps aren't working for people because it's only like the top 15% of men who are matching with the top 50% of women. People are afraid of having sex with other people because of the all of the consent issues and what they've seen in the broader media. That will get you in trouble. And in addition, on that front, people are just finding, I'll just be addicted to pornography, and that's what I'll do on that. With respect to money, if you're a Gen Z, you were born into the great financial crisis, Zuccotti Park, Occupy Wall Street. Your dad's 401k became a 201k, when you were in elementary school. And now you're graduating into jobs that don't exist. You were told to just go to college, but now all the jobs are being taken by generative AI. And then so that kind of covers money and tech. And then from a political standpoint, from a power standpoint, the only two, kind of presidential figures that you've known and or been able to vote for were either Donald Trump or Joe Biden. And so those were probably not very inspiring figures, for you in terms of,
You don't say.
putting power, putting hope in that kind of thing. And so when you think about, okay, well, if I'm, in the 18 to 25-year-old time frame right now, well, I look at the idols of my parents and grandparents, and they're not really working. And so what else really do I have left besides, and I already know that there's more than the five senses. I know that there's something that's transcendent that's there. So I'm either going to find that in kind of remixed religion, or I'm going to find that in Jesus. And so I think that things like the Asbury revivals and other kind of tangential things related to that, or the report about the Quiet Revival in the UK, I think those are very natural and logical conclusions to a Western world that really isn't working for young people the way that it has in the past.
Yeah. Very well put. You guys have any other thoughts on that?
I'll just say, I agree with everything that Mike just said. I'll just say, my book came out in January, and then immediately after there were all these headlines about everyone's becoming Christian again. I thought that's going to be great for book sales. But what is encouraging to me about that is, for the past 4 or 5 years before the vibe shift happened, it really felt like deconstruction, deconversion was the headline over the church. And so it just felt like we were dealing with this mass kind of cultural phenomena. I was so thankful for Mike's study on the de-churching because it helped me realize, deconstruction and this is a sliver of a bigger thing that's going on, not the whole thing, which it felt like for a really long time, basically until your research came out. And so what I'm thankful about this now is it's not that deconstruction is going away. Like, people are still going to deconstruct their faith. This is a normal part of the life of faith. This is still going to happen. What we can kind of stop doing is treating this at a meta-cultural level and start focusing on the people who are going through it. And less so kind of like, how do we stop this from happening? How do we prevent deconstruction? It's like, that's helpful to some degree, but like, I want to have a conversation with you, and not you as a cultural avatar for all of these things going on, but you as a person, as a friend, as a pastor, as a kid, and be able to actually walk with you through that. And so to me, I'm obviously encouraged by hearing about Gen Z in particular wanting to become Christian. I think that's great. It doesn't put an end to deconstruction, but I'm kind of glad the meta level conversation has sort of moved on and we can just focus on the people now.
Yeah, I think that's nice.
It would be wonderful if there really is a return to faith. It really would. It would be great. It would be great on a lot of different levels. I can't help but be just a tad skeptical, though. And here's why. Because in the internet age, every news agency needs to write about something every day. And number two is that if you look at the numbers of the percentage of people who identified as Christians, not evangelicals, not Catholics, not Orthodox, just Christians in general, it has been consistently high. Since the 1970s, it's been upwards to 88 to 90% until you get to the 1990s. In the 1990s, there is a massive drop. And it's hovering right now about 64% of Americans identify as Christians. In the 1990s, about 5% of people identified as secular or none or no religion. That today is upwards around 29 or 30%. So we see this massive drop off. Ryan Burge, your co-author, talks about how nuns, those people who have no religion, in that massive drop off were made, they were not born. What he means by that is they once had a faith and then they left the faith and now they identify as a nun. This plateau that we have is a plateau that we've only seen. So the drop off has now plateaued around 64%. But we don't have anywhere near enough information to determine whether that's an actual plateau or whether it's the bottom of the curve and it's going to head up or whether it's going to continue to go down.
Right.
So I called Ryan and I asked him, hey, what's the deal with this? And he said, it's great that we have reports of Gen Z turning to faith, but as it stands right now, 46% of people who identify in Gen Z identify as a nun or as a secular faith, secular and no faith, which is a pretty substantial number of people. Those folks have been born, not made. And they're producing, as generational replacement takes place, as boomers pass off the scene, what you're having younger generations come up who are actually being born into their secularity and being a nun. For example, the Springdale, I think it's is it Springdale who does the research? Yeah, Springdale Research Institute came out with a study on Generation Alpha, which is now up to about 15 years old. They say 22% of Generation Alpha is secular and a nun. When you compare baby boomers at the same age, up to about 13 to 15, 88% of those people were identified as Christian, right? So only about 12% identified as a nun. So it would be great if that's actually what's happening. But I suspect what's going to happen is that we're not going to be making a whole lot of more nuns, that the deconversion, deconstruction tsunami has probably slowed, but there will be a slower pace of attrition as older generations pass off the scene and younger generations continue to make more nuns.
What John is saying here is absolutely correct. The
Nice.
The leveling off that we're seeing in terms of disaffiliation of Christianity and the basically plateauing of the rise of the nuns will be a temporary phenomenon unless we see revival or massive renewal in this country. Here's why. It's just simply generational replacement.
Math.
Because as Gen Z and Gen Alpha become adults and the greatest generation and the boomers pass away, there's just massive differences in the levels of religiosity, belief, behavior, and belonging between those two generations. And so I do think a lot of the headlines on some of these things, at least in the United States, are overblown. However, the Quiet Revival Report in the UK is very, very, very interesting. And the data there is very, very good. We will know more about this very soon. Sure. Ryan and I are doing a 100,000 person general population survey that literally finishes this week. So we will know a lot more about what's going on among Gen Z in a matter of weeks.
Great. This is very helpful. And I wanted to just say just one thing I've thought about when I've looked at this stuff is the internet is full of fashion. It was unfashionable to be a Christian, and now there is a certain fashion to it. Show yourself buying a Bible on TikTok at Barnes & Noble, and this kind of thing. It's like there's a virality, a trend to it. It's like that's not going to make disciples. And I think that kind of comes back to your point. We have a responsibility to interact with individuals to help teach them about Jesus Christ and go deep with them in Scripture, not just show somebody, TikTok is the sort of the new thing, but 5 to 10 years ago, it seemed like you'd always see these people with their Bible open and like the steaming coffee photo, and you're like, it's like, is that person like a serious walking Christian? I mean, obviously you can take a photo and follow God, but I'm like, showing yourself on Instagram reading the Bible does not mean you're actually reading your Bible. And so I think we need discipleship in this country. We need serious teaching of the word, and we can pray for revival. But yeah, I think we should be at least somewhat reluctant to assume that this is just going to like crack open and run up in the other direction. Why don't we draw the line there? Thanks for coming, audience, our live audience. Thanks for joining us, guys. Just a brief comment as we kind of wrap up. I think sometimes people get anxious or, well, as we've mentioned, and nervous when they interact with this kind of stuff. I think they feel it as kind of a pessimistic picture. And I think it's worth note that our founders in this church were essentially could have been described as de-churched, deconverted. Well, we didn't use the term deconstruction. You know, Derrida hadn't hit the scene too much here in the U.S. yet. But the point is that they would fit that description. And they all came to faith. They started a church on Ohio State's campus. And so I think we need to remember, pray for, have those thoughtful, slower conversations with people. Because, today's deconverted Christian could be tomorrow's church planter. As Christians, we believe that Jesus died in the most gruesome and disgusting way known to man. He was crucified and he rose from the dead. So I think we need to remember that when we approach this, that we follow a God of hope and not a God of despair. None of you guys have communicated that, but I think when people hear this data, they get anxious. They're like, "What are you saying? What are you saying?" And I think we need to remember that Jesus rose from the dead, and no matter what we're seeing here, like he is going to come back, and we can have hope. Let's draw the line there. Thanks, guys.